In the final, incredibly tense days of May 1942, the tiny coral outpost of Midway Atoll was systematically transformed into an island braced for total, apocalyptic annihilation. The American defenders stationed on this isolated patch of sand knew with absolute certainty that a massive Japanese armada, boasting 4 elite aircraft carriers, heavy battleships, and thousands of battle-hardened amphibious troops, was racing across the expanse of the Pacific Ocean to seize the island. Midway was a deceptively small geography, but it possessed 2 invaluable strategic assets that could decide the fate of the entire global conflict: a fully operational airfield with multiple concrete runways and a heavily fortified submarine, refueling, and repair base. If the advancing Japanese military captured these vital facilities intact, they would instantly possess an unsinkable aircraft carrier parked just 1,200 miles from Honolulu, effectively shifting the front line of the war and putting the entire west coast of the United States within regular bombing range of Imperial aircraft. The commander of the island's Marine garrison, Colonel Harold Shannon, and the naval base commander, Commander Cyril Simard, received a series of highly confidential, top-secret orders sent directly from Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters in Pearl Harbor. The encrypted message carried a grim, uncompromising directive: defend the island with every weapon at your disposal, but under no circumstances allow the infrastructure of the base to fall into enemy hands intact. If the defensive lines collapsed and the island was overrun, the defenders were ordered to execute a pre-coordinated detonation plan that would completely obliterate Midway from the face of the earth before retreating into the sea. What followed over the next 72 hours was one of the most intense, systematic demolition preparations ever undertaken in modern military history. Under the cover of pitch darkness, specialized engineering crews and construction battalions worked frantically to turn the entire naval base and airfield into a massive, interconnected network of explosives. Millions of gallons of highly volatile aviation fuel, stored in massive above-ground steel tanks, were rigged with electrical remote detonators and heavy blocks of industrial dynamite. The deep underground ammunition magazines, holding hundreds of tons of high-explosive aerial bombs, artillery shells, and small arms ammunition, were meticulously wired with timed fuses and secondary backup detonators. Every hangar, every water tower, every radio facility, and every single inch of the concrete runways was carefully drilled and packed tightly with thousands of pounds of TNT. The strategic goal was to create a perfectly synchronized explosion so severe and all-consuming that it would instantly reduce every building, dock, runway, and fortification to absolute, unrecoverable rubble, leaving nothing for the Japanese invasion force but a scorching, useless heap of irradiated sand. The defenders were living on top of a volatile powder keg, fully aware that a single stray spark could trigger their total destruction before the enemy even arrived. The Scorched Earth preparations extended far beyond the obvious military structures into the vital life support infrastructure of the atoll. The complex water distillation plants, which represented the absolute only source of fresh water on the arid, sun-bleached islands, were carefully rigged with specialized thermite grenades designed to melt the internal machinery into useless puddles of slag in a matter of seconds. Top-secret codebooks, highly classified encryption machines, and sensitive radio communication equipment were packed tightly into reinforced incendiary canisters, ready to be instantly vaporized at the pull of a single lever to prevent the enemy from breaking secure networks. Marines buried thousands of powerful landmines beneath the sandy beaches where the Japanese landing craft were expected to hit, while naval personnel prepared to scuttle their own patrol boats directly in the narrow harbor channels to completely block the entry points. The psychological strain on the young soldiers was immense. They were sleeping, eating, and loading weapons surrounded by miles of active detonator wires, knowing that their own home was primed to explode beneath their feet if they failed to hold the perimeter line for even a few minutes. When the first massive Japanese carrier airstrike hit Midway on the morning of June 4th, the island erupted into a terrifying storm of fire and screaming steel. Massive bombs dropped from high altitude, slammed directly into the hangars, aircraft repair shops, and fuel depots, triggering some of the preset demolitions prematurely and sending giant plumes of oily black smoke thousands of feet into the sky. On the ground, amidst the absolute chaos of falling debris and anti-aircraft fire, the dedicated demolition teams stood rigidly by their master detonator boards. Their hands shook with adrenaline as they waited in the dark bunkers for the final, definitive command to blow the entire island to pieces. They could hear the distant roar of naval gunfire and the chatter of machine guns along the beaches, signaling that the Imperial landing forces might be closing in. But the final order to activate the Scorched Earth network never came. Miles away to the northeast, the American carrier-based dive bombers caught the Japanese fleet at the exact moment of its highest vulnerability, destroying all 4 enemy carriers in a matter of minutes and breaking the spine of the invasion force. The Japanese transport ships turned back into the safety of the Western Pacific, and the vast demolition network on Midway was painstakingly dismantled piece by piece over the following weeks. The base survived, but the secret preparations revealed the absolute desperation of the American High Command, a force prepared to burn its own kingdom to the ground rather than see its infrastructure fly the flag of an expanding empire. The logistics of creating such a massive demolition web under a strict time constraint required an unprecedented level of cooperation between different branches of the military. Navy Seabees worked side by side with Marine infantrymen, running miles of heavy copper wire through the sand trenches to connect the separate blast zones to central firing points located deep inside reinforced concrete command bunkers. They had to ensure that the electrical currents would be strong enough to detonate charges blocks away, even if the primary generators were knocked out by enemy bombardment. To solve this problem, they engineered a series of backup battery banks salvaged from damaged submarines and trucks, creating a redundant power grid that guaranteed the destruction of the base under the worst possible combat conditions. Every step of the process had to be executed with absolute precision. A single short circuit could leave a vital runway intact, allowing the Japanese to land their own transport planes and turn the tide of the entire campaign. The pressure on Colonel Shannon during these critical hours was monumental. He had to balance the immediate tactical defense of the island with the long-term strategic necessity of its total destruction. If he gave the order to blow the base too early, he would destroy his own heavy defensive guns and ammunition supplies while his men were still fighting off the initial landings, rendering them completely defenseless. If he waited too long, a fast-moving Japanese squad could seize the central command bunker and cut the detonation wires, securing the pristine airfield for their own reinforcement waves. Shannon spent the night of June 3rd walking the perimeter lines, checking the placement of the charges himself, and speaking quietly with the young Marines who were assigned to hold the forward trenches. He knew that for many of these men, the detonation of the base would mean their own certain death, as there would be no time to evacuate the atoll once the thousands of pounds of TNT were ignited simultaneously. The hidden nature of these orders meant that the vast majority of the public, and even many of the soldiers on the mainland, had no idea how close the United States came to losing its primary mid-Pacific base by its own hand. Had the dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown failed to find the Japanese carriers that morning, the history books would read very differently. Midway would have vanished in a series of catastrophic explosions that would have been visible for hundreds of miles across the open ocean, leaving behind a smoking, barren reef devoid of life and strategic value. This extreme willingness to sacrifice a vital base underscored a fundamental truth of the Pacific War. The conflict was an all-out struggle for systemic survival, where property, wealth, and territory meant absolutely nothing compared to the overriding necessity of denying strategic momentum to the enemy. The unexploded dynamite beneath the runways of Midway stood as silent proof that the path to ultimate victory was paved with the willingness to lose everything. The specific design of the demolition plan split the atoll into distinct sectors that could be destroyed sequentially depending on how the battle unfolded. Eastern Island, which contained the main airfield, was prioritized for complete eradication, while Sand Island, home to the communication facilities and power plants, was scheduled to be blown only if the airfield was entirely lost. This modular approach allowed the commanders to maintain operational flexibility, using the defensive positions on Sand Island to cover the retreat of surviving infantry units, while the runways next door were turned into a cratered wasteland. The engineering behind this plan was masterfully cruel. The charges were placed not just to destroy the surface structures, but to fracture the underlying coral foundation of the runways, creating massive sinkholes that would take months of heavy construction equipment to repair or fill, rendering the airfield completely useless to the Imperial Air Forces for the foreseeable future. As the early morning light of June 4th revealed the incoming waves of Japanese aircraft on the radar screens, the base fell into a tense, silent anticipation. The power lines were switched over to the demolition circuits, and the safety switches on the master detonators were thrown into the armed position. The men inside the command bunkers could hear the high-pitched whine of the sirens echoing across the sand dunes, followed quickly by the thunderous roar of the island's anti-aircraft batteries opening fire. When the first bombs detonate near the hospital and the fuel dumps, the ground shook violently, causing the dust to fall from the concrete ceilings of the bunkers onto the maps below. The demolition officers kept their hands firmly on the firing plungers, matching the reports of enemy breaches with the corresponding switches on their panels, ready to sacrifice their hard work to save the wider war effort. The victory achieved by the naval pilots at sea ultimately rendered the sacrifice of the base unnecessary, but the strategic doctrine that birthed the plan remained a core component of American planning throughout the long march across the Pacific. The Scorched Earth mindset ensured that every island outpost developed by the United States was treated not as a permanent colony, but as a temporary tactical asset that could be discarded the moment its defensive value was compromised. This flexibility stood in sharp contrast to the Japanese defensive strategy, which viewed the loss of territory as an absolute spiritual failure, forcing their garrisons to fight to the death to hold every inch of sand, regardless of its actual strategic worth. By viewing their infrastructure through a lens of cold mathematical utility, the American High Command demonstrated a pragmatic approach to total war that prioritized systemic survival over institutional pride. When the smoke from the battle finally cleared and the repair crews began the arduous process of rebuilding the damaged structures on Midway, they found that the hidden detonation networks had survived the bombardment completely intact. For months afterward, specialized ordnance disposal teams had to carefully crawl through the dark crawl spaces underneath the reinforced runways and deep inside the fuel tanks to remove the live blocks of TNT and disconnect the miles of electrical wiring that had been laid under the cover of darkness. The island was slowly returned to its standard operational state, its guns pointing back out toward the western horizon. But the memory of those tense hours remained etched into the minds of the men who had stood ready to turn their own base into a blazing inferno. They had looked into the abyss of total defeat and had chosen to pull the trigger themselves rather than surrender, leaving behind a legacy of absolute determination that defined the spirit of the generation that won the war. The operational documents detailing the Scorched Earth plan were eventually gathered, classified, and filed away in the deep archives of the Department of the Navy, where they remained hidden from public view for decades. They reveal a level of detailed planning that covered everything from the amount of gasoline needed to burn the administrative offices to the specific methods for destroying the mechanical tools inside the machine shops. Nothing was left to chance. The manual even specified how to systematically smash the glass lenses of the airfield searchlights and the vacuum tubes of the radar installations using heavy sledgehammers. This granular approach to destruction ensured that even if a portion of the demolition charges failed to ignite, the base would still be rendered a useless hull, stripped of any technical or logistical value, forcing the Japanese to spend valuable time shipping resources from the home islands to rebuild the facility from scratch. Ultimately, the unexecuted demolition of Midway stands as a powerful historical metaphor for the hidden costs of global conflict. It demonstrates that the path to victory often requires a nation to contemplate its own destruction, balancing the preservation of its values against the physical survival of its territory. The young Marines and Seabees who stood by those detonator switches were prepared to erase their own footprints from the sand to ensure that the wider march of freedom could continue across the globe. Their silent readiness to execute a terrifying command remains one of the great untold chapters of the Battle of Midway, a reminder that the greatest acts of military defiance sometimes involve the willingness to destroy everything you have built to ensure that the enemy cannot use it to destroy your home. As the war transitioned into its later phases and the American forces advanced toward the Japanese home islands, the lessons learned during the Scorched Earth preparations at Midway were applied to new bases constructed across the captured territories of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The engineering protocols for rapid infrastructure destruction became standard training for all specialized construction battalions, ensuring that the entire Pacific logistics network was built with a built-in self-destruct mechanism. This operational philosophy created a defensive shield that made it impossible for the Japanese military to launch a successful counteroffensive, as any base they managed to recapture would be instantly transformed into a barren wasteland before they could secure its parameters. The silent dynamite of Midway had rewritten the rules of global logistics, proving that the ultimate defense was the absolute refusal to leave anything behind for the enemy to seize.